I went up to Vermont to visit a friend who had a small cabin tucked deep in the woods. It was early fall, the air sharp with that mix of pine and damp leaves that clings to your clothes when you walk outside. My friend wasn't there when I arrived, so I had the place to myself for a while. I unpacked slowly, moving around the single-room cabin with its wood stove, its old timber walls, and the smell of smoke in everything. It felt quiet in a way I wasn't used to. There was no background noise, no hum of cars or voices, just the steady hush of wind through trees and the distant knock of branches against each other. After I settled in, I decided to walk around the property. My friend had always said that the land behind the cabin stretched back for a few acres before meeting up with government-owned forest. I stepped off the back porch and followed a faint path downhill. The ground was soft and uneven with moss and pine needles. The trees pressed close, thick trunks that let in only narrow shafts of light. I moved slowly, listening to the sound of my own boots crunching on sticks. The deeper I went, the more it felt like the air thickened. At first, there was nothing unusual, just trees, rocks, and low shrubs. But then I caught something on the ground ahead. At first, I thought it was just a scatter of leaves. When I walked closer, I realized it wasn't leaves at all. It was birds, dozens of them, small ones mostly, sparrows, finches, starlings. Their bodies were stiff, feathers ruffled, wings curled in. They had been placed deliberately, not scattered the way they would be if they'd fallen from trees. They formed a near-perfect circle, their heads all angled inwards, like spokes on a wheel. I froze. It didn't look like something nature would do. The edges of the circle were clean, almost measured. I walked closer, careful not to step inside it. The smell hit me before I knelt down. Sharp, sour, like wet feathers and decay. Some of the birds were fresh, their eyes still glossy, while others looked dried out, their bones showing beneath featherless patches. Whoever had done this had been at it for a while. I stayed crouched there, staring at them. My stomach turned. The longer I looked, the more wrong it seemed. This wasn't just kids messing around. There were too many, collected and arranged with too much care. It made me uneasy in a way I couldn't put into words. It felt deliberate, almost ritualistic, but I didn't let myself think about that for long. I stood up and scanned the woods around me. The silence was heavy. No birds called from the trees. No squirrels moved across the ground. It was strange. Usually in woods like these, you hear something. But here, the air felt empty. I turned back toward the cabin, walking quickly, trying not to imagine someone out there watching me. When I reached the cabin, I shut the back door harder than I meant to. I washed my hands even though I hadn't touched the birds. I tried to shake it off, but every time I looked out the window toward the tree line, I felt that same unease return. I kept thinking about how carefully the bodies had been placed, how many trips it must have taken to collect them, and why anyone would even bother. That night, I lay on the couch, unable to fall asleep. The cabin was too quiet. I heard every creak in the wood, every small tap against the windows. My mind wouldn't let go of the image of the circle. I kept picturing someone out there, walking the woods at night with a bag, collecting dead things. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe something had dragged them there, but no animal would have made a perfect circle. At some point after midnight, I finally drifted off. When I woke up, the air inside the cabin was cold. The wood stove had burned out. I stepped outside to gather kindling. The sun was pale and weak, the ground damp with morning dew. I hesitated before looking toward the woods, but curiosity pulled me back. I followed the same trail downhill. When I reached the spot, I froze again. The circle of birds was gone. All of them, not a feather, not a wing left behind. The ground where they had been was smooth, almost swept clean. The moss was pressed down in the same circle shape, but the bodies had been removed. My skin prickled. Whoever had placed them there had come back in the night. They had carried them away while I was asleep in the cabin. The thought made my chest tighten. They had been that close, moving just out of sight, while I lay in the dark with no idea. I turned and walked fast back to the cabin, checking over my shoulder the whole way. Every crack in the trees felt like eyes watching. Inside, I locked the doors and sat at the table, trying to steady myself. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. It wasn't just the birds anymore. It was the proof that someone had been on the property, close enough to the cabin, maybe even listening. I thought about leaving, but the road was long, and my car was parked out front in plain sight. I couldn't shake the image of stepping outside with my bags and finding someone waiting in the trees, so I stayed. I spent the day sitting near the stove with the curtains closed, listening for footsteps that never came. By evening, I couldn't take the silence anymore. I told myself I would just check, just to make sure nothing else had been left behind. I walked back down the same path as the sun sank low. My heart pounded the entire way. When I reached the clearing, I stopped dead. There was another circle, not of birds this time, but of small stones, each one smooth and gray, lined up perfectly edge to edge. In the center was a single feather, black and glossy, laid flat against the moss. That was when I knew it wasn't random. Someone was using that patch of woods for something. Maybe they had been doing it for weeks, months, even years, and I had stumbled across it by accident. I was on their land, sitting in a cabin that didn't belong to me, with no phone signal and no neighbors for miles. I backed away slowly, then turned and hurried uphill, barely keeping my breath steady. I stayed awake the entire night, every sound sharp in my ears, waiting for the creak of the door or the thud of footsteps on the porch. None came. When the morning finally broke, I packed my bags as quickly as I could and left. I didn't look back at the cabin, and I didn't take the back trail again. I drove until the trees thinned out and the road opened into town. Only then did I let myself breathe properly. Even now, I don't know what I saw out there. I don't know who made those circles or why they chose birds first and then stones. But I do know that whoever it was had been there in those woods at the same time as me. They had come close enough to clear everything away in the dark, and they had left something new behind, like a message. The part that stays with me most isn't the circle itself. It's the silence of the woods, how even the animals kept away. It's the thought that someone had been walking out there, moving with purpose, while I sat in a cabin thinking I was safe. And it's the fact that if I had walked just a little deeper, maybe I would have found them instead of their work. That's why I will never go back to that cabin again. I went up to the cabin because I wanted a few days of quiet. It sat deep in the woods, about a 20-minute drive from the nearest paved road. And when I first pulled up, everything felt calm. The place was small and simple. One main room with a wood stove, a little kitchen area, and a bedroom off to the side. I had brought enough food and water for a week, along with a couple of lanterns and a generator in case the power gave out. The air outside was cool, with that damp smell of earth and pine you only get far from town. The ground around the cabin was soft from recent rain, and when I stepped out of my car, I noticed how quiet it was. No traffic, no distant hum of town noise, just the occasional crow and the sound of wind slipping through trees. At first, the isolation felt good. I stacked wood near the porch, set up my gear inside, and made a small fire in the stove. I liked the rhythm of it, collecting, arranging, preparing. The stillness made me pay attention to every little sound. The creak of the old wooden floorboards under my boots, the crackle of pine needles burning, the steady tick of the lantern cooling down after I turned it off. By nightfall, the forest had settled into a heavy quiet. When I stepped outside to breathe the cool air, the darkness seemed thicker than what I was used to back home. No streetlights, no glow from distant houses, just pitch black stretching out in every direction, the kind of dark where your eyes never really adjust. I could only see what my flashlight caught: sharp trunks of trees, long shadows across wet ground, the faint mist drifting low between the undergrowth. That first night, I noticed something odd. I had gone to bed and was lying in the small bedroom, listening to the fire pop in the stove. Sometime after midnight, I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure what had stirred me. Maybe the quiet had changed, maybe it was instinct, but I found myself holding my breath, listening. For a long moment, I thought it was nothing. Then I heard it, a faint crunch of leaves outside. One step, then stillness. Another step. It wasn't fast or frantic. It was slow, deliberate, like someone trying to move quietly but not careful enough. I sat up and tried to convince myself it was an animal. A deer, maybe, or even a raccoon. but the steps seemed heavier than that, too spaced out for anything small. I stayed still for at least 10 minutes, straining to hear, until the sound faded off into the woods. Eventually, I told myself it was nothing and managed to fall asleep again. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. The ground was damp enough that tracks should have shown, but I didn't see much, just disturbed leaves near the treeline. I told myself again it was probably deer and pushed it out of my head. The day passed quietly. I read, cooked a little food, walked a short trail that looped behind the cabin. By evening, I felt more relaxed again, as if the strange moment in the night hadn't happened. But that second night was worse. I woke again sometime around 2 in the morning, and the sound was back. This time it was closer, right along the side of the cabin. Leaves crushed under weight, slow pauses between each step. I lay in bed stiff as a board, staring at the faint glow of dying embers in the stove. My ears strained to follow the movement. Whoever or whatever it was circled halfway around the cabin before going quiet again. When daylight finally came, I checked the ground outside once more. Near the far wall of the cabin, I found clear imprints in the soft earth. They weren't boot prints, but they weren't from an animal either. They looked like the worn tread of old shoes, pressed deep into the ground by someone fairly heavy. I felt my stomach twist as I realized it hadn't been my imagination. Someone had been out there. I told myself maybe it was just a hiker passing through, maybe someone lost, but the tracks didn't head in or out. They just lingered around the cabin. That detail unsettled me more than anything. The third night, I couldn't relax. I sat up with the lantern low, waiting, listening. The forest outside pressed in on the cabin like a wall. Hours went by, and then, like clockwork, the sound returned. This time, there were more than just footsteps. I heard the faint creak of wood, like someone testing the porch boards. My skin prickled. Then came the brush of fingers, or something like it, dragging slowly along the outside wall. I gripped the flashlight I'd set beside me, but I didn't move. My breathing was shallow, my chest tight, and I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I waited for the sound of the door handle turning, for glass breaking, for something. But after several long minutes, everything went silent again. The following day, I seriously considered packing up and leaving, but stubbornness kept me there. I didn't want to feel like I'd been chased off by nothing more than sounds in the dark. I spent the day restless, pacing, checking the treeline every few minutes. I barely ate. Every snapped twig in the woods put me on edge. That night, I pushed a chair against the door and kept the lantern burning. My nerves were shot, and every sound outside felt magnified. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it again. Footsteps, slower this time, stopping and starting. They lingered at the back of the cabin. Then silence. I stayed awake until dawn, then went outside to look again. That's when I saw it. Behind the cabin, in the wet earth, was a clear print of a boot. And beside it, pressed into the mud, was the impression of a knee, as if someone had crouched there, waiting, watching. My stomach dropped. I scanned the tree line, heart hammering, half expecting to see someone still there. But the woods were empty, calm, quiet like nothing had ever happened. That was enough for me. I packed my gear as quickly as I could and loaded the car. Every minute I was outside, I felt eyes on me from the forest. The silence felt heavy, almost mocking, as if the trees themselves knew something I didn't. When I finally pulled out and drove down the dirt road, I didn't breathe easy until the cabin was far behind me. Looking back now, I don't know what the person out there wanted. They never tried to break in, never shouted, never showed themselves. They just circled the cabin night after night, close enough that I could hear every careful step. Maybe they were waiting for me to come outside. Maybe they were testing how long I'd stay. All I know is I'll never go back to that cabin again. The thought of being surrounded by that much dark, knowing someone else was out there watching and moving slowly around me, is enough to keep me in the city for good. Out there, no one would have heard me if something happened. No neighbors, no cars passing by, just endless woods swallowing up every sound. And that's what unsettles me most, the silence. It wasn't just the footsteps, the scraping, or the prints in the mud. It was how quiet it all was, how patient. Whoever was out there didn't need to rush. They had time, and they knew I was alone. We had been looking forward to that trip for weeks. The cabin was tucked into the foothills of Washington, surrounded by tall evergreens and the kind of damp moss that clings to everything up there. It was the kind of place that promised quiet, a break from traffic and noise, with only the sound of wind in the trees and water running in the nearby creek. The road leading to it was gravel, winding and narrow, and by the time we pulled in on the first evening, I already felt like we were in another world. The cabin itself was simple, a weathered one-story place with a small porch, a wood stove, and a view that opened out into a thick wall of forest. We had rented it online, thinking it would be a good spot for a long weekend away from work and phones. I remember unloading the truck and noticing how still the air felt, even though the woods seemed alive with the smell of damp pine needles and the distant call of birds. That first night was uneventful. We cooked a meal, built a fire in the stove, and sat outside for a while watching the last light fade behind the trees. The sky turned from gray to black quickly, and the forest swallowed every trace of color. It was darker than what we were used to back home. You couldn't see anything beyond the reach of the porch light, just a wall of shadows and the sense of space stretching out beyond them. The next morning, I noticed the first strange thing. When I stepped outside to grab something from the truck, the driver's side door was cracked open. I knew I had locked it the night before, and I never leave it open. Inside, the radio was on, faint static hissing through the speakers. The keys were inside with me in the cabin, so it didn't make sense. I figured maybe I had somehow pressed a button on the fob when we were unloading, though I didn't remember carrying it outside. I switched the radio off, closed the door, and thought little of it. But the next morning, it happened again. The door was wide open, and the radio was on, buzzing low static like before. This time, I felt a weight in my chest. I knew I had double-checked the locks the night before. The truck had been parked only a few steps from the cabin, well within sight of the windows. We hadn't heard anything in the night, no footsteps, no doors opening. The ground was soft from recent rain, but I didn't see any clear prints, just scattered pine needles pressed into mud. I told myself maybe it was some kind of electrical fault, but that didn't explain the open door. I checked the latch, tested the locks, and found nothing wrong. I thought about raccoons or maybe a bear, but there weren't any scratch marks or signs of an animal forcing its way inside. It looked like someone had simply opened the door and sat there long enough to turn the radio on. That thought stayed with me all day. We tried to enjoy ourselves, cooking breakfast and walking a short trail near the cabin, but I kept glancing back at the truck. Each time, I felt the same unease, like it wasn't just a vehicle sitting there, but something waiting. The woods that had felt calming on the first day now looked dense and secretive. Every sway of a branch or sudden crack of a twig made me turn my head. That night, I locked the truck carefully. I checked all the doors twice, tugging on each handle. I even pressed down the lock manually before shutting the driver's side door. When we went inside, I set the keys on the table by the bed. The silence of the forest pressed in as we tried to sleep. I lay awake for a long time, listening. At some point, I drifted off. In the morning, the door was open again. This time, both front doors stood wide, the cab light glowing faintly even though the battery had to be drained. The radio buzzed louder than before, like someone had turned the volume up. The air inside the truck smelled faintly of damp clothes, as though someone had been sitting in it wet. My stomach sank. I walked around the vehicle slowly, scanning the ground, the edges of the forest, the cabin behind me. I felt exposed standing there in the morning quiet. There were no clear tracks, but pine needles had been disturbed near the passenger side. It looked like someone had stood there, leaning in. By now, the unease had grown into something heavier. It didn't feel like a glitch or an accident. Someone was coming up to the cabin at night, unlocking the truck, and sitting in it. We hadn't heard them, but that didn't matter. The thought of someone being that close while we slept, quiet enough to leave without a trace, made the air feel thick and wrong. We decided to cut the trip short, but we still had one more night before we could realistically leave. I didn't say it out loud, but I didn't sleep much that last night. I sat awake in the dark, staring at the faint outline of the window. I thought I heard something once, just the soft crunch of pine needles, but it could have been the wind, an animal, or maybe even my own heartbeat. When morning came, I went straight to the truck. Both front doors were open again, and this time the glove box was hanging wide. Papers were scattered on the seat, and the radio buzzed so loud it almost hurt my ears. It looked deliberate now. Whoever had been there wanted it to be obvious. That was enough. We packed quickly, hardly eating, throwing our things into bags and shoving them into the truck. I kept glancing into the trees as we worked, my nerves raw, half expecting to see someone watching. When we finally pulled away, I didn't look back. The whole drive out, I thought about what it meant. Someone had to have been coming up to the cabin at night, close enough to see when we turned in, close enough to slip up to the truck without waking us. They hadn't tried to break into the cabin itself. They hadn't stolen anything. They had just opened the doors, turned on the radio, and sat there. That detail bothers me most. Sitting in the truck, listening to the faint hiss of static, while we slept only a few feet away. I don't know if they were waiting for us to come out, if they were testing how far they could push before we noticed, or if they just wanted to prove that they could get that close without being caught. Whatever the reason, I'll never forget the feeling of stepping out each morning to see the doors open and that low static filling the air. It wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, but it was enough to make me realize how vulnerable we had been out there, surrounded by forest, miles from anyone, with only thin walls and a locked door between us and whoever was moving around at night. It was a quiet kind of threat, not the kind you can chase off with noise or light, but the kind that settles in your mind and lingers long after you leave. To this day, whenever I hear static on the radio, I think of that cabin and the open truck doors in the damp Washington morning, and the fact that someone was close enough to touch the vehicle while we slept without ever making a sound. It was late October in Idaho, the kind of cold that sinks deep into your bones once the sun drops, the kind of quiet where sound carries for miles. A few of us had pooled together to rent an old cabin for a hunting trip, nothing fancy. Just a weathered structure tucked deep in the timber near a creek that cut through the valley. The roof sagged a little, the porch leaned, but it was solid enough for a week away chasing elk. The days were long, and the forest felt endless out there. Pines stretched up the ridges, and the ground was soft with old needles. Every breath hung in the air as we tracked sign along ridgelines and across meadows. That particular day, we had gone out early, hiking hard, following a set of fresh tracks through brush so thick it clawed at our clothes. The hours slipped by without us realizing how late it was getting. When the sun began dropping behind the ridges, we headed back, our boots sore and our packs heavy with sweat-soaked layers. The cabin sat in a small clearing, a patch of open ground surrounded by tall timber. As we walked up, everything looked the same as we'd left it. Smoke still lingered faintly from the fire pit where we had cooked breakfast that morning, and the porch was littered with a few wood chips from where we had split logs. Nothing looked disturbed from the outside, but when we opened the door, the air inside felt wrong. At first, I couldn't figure out what I was looking at. Then it hit me. All of our gear, packs, sleeping bags, rifles, boots, even food supplies had been moved. Every single thing that had been scattered around the cabin when we left was now stacked into neat piles in the center of the wooden floor. It wasn't just dumped there. It was deliberate. Each pile had been arranged carefully. Sleeping bags rolled tight and stacked like logs. Boots lined up in pairs, soles cleanly pressed together. Rifles leaned upright, side by side, as though displayed. Even the loose food, granola bars and cans and bags had been gathered and sorted, stacked neatly in another pile. It looked almost clinical, like someone had spent hours organizing every piece of our belongings with precise hands. The silence of the cabin pressed down heavy. I stood there in the doorway, staring at those piles, my stomach twisting in a way that had nothing to do with hunger or fatigue. I could hear the others shifting behind me, boots creaking on the porch boards, the sound of breath catching in the throat. None of us said anything, but the air felt charged, the realization dawning on us all at the same time. Someone had been in the cabin while we were gone. The thought of it made my skin crawl. The door hadn't been broken. The windows weren't shattered. Whoever it was had come in quietly, taken their time, and touched every single thing we had. They hadn't stolen anything. They hadn't smashed or ruined anything. They had just rearranged it like they wanted us to know they'd been there. We stepped inside slowly. The wood floor groaned under our weight, and the smell of cold air mixed with damp earth hung in the room. I scanned every corner, half expecting someone to still be crouched in the shadows, waiting. But the place was empty. The chairs were exactly where we'd left them. The stove cold, the lanterns untouched. Only the piles of gear broke the sense of stillness. I couldn't stop staring at the way it was arranged. It wasn't random. Whoever did it had placed things with purpose. A stack of boots, sawls down, tongues tucked neatly inside. The rifles not leaning sloppy, but straight, lined like fence posts. Food items grouped together by type, cans with cans, bars with bars, packets stacked evenly. Even our coats had been folded. There was an order to it that didn't feel rushed. Whoever did it had taken their time, comfortable enough to be in our space without worry. That detail sank into me like ice. The thought that someone had been inside while we were miles away in the woods, moving slowly, handling every piece of gear we owned, confident enough to stay however long they wanted. We checked outside, circling the cabin. The ground was soft in places from melted frost, but there weren't clear tracks, just disturbed pine needles and faint impressions that could have been ours from earlier. The forest stretched out in every direction, quiet and heavy, as if holding onto a secret. Back inside, the piles sat there like some kind of message we couldn't read. None of us wanted to sit down or even touch our things. The walls of the cabin suddenly felt thinner, the windows smaller, the door flimsier. The whole place felt less like a shelter and more like a trap. That night was long. None of us slept much. Every creak of the old wood sounded sharper. Every gust of wind through the trees felt like it carried footsteps. I kept picturing someone out there, standing just beyond the glow of the lantern, waiting. The fire in the stove burned low, and the shadows pressed heavy against the walls. By morning, nothing else had been touched. The piles sat exactly as we'd found them, undisturbed. But the damage was done. The sense of safety was gone. We packed fast, not bothering to sort everything out properly. I stuffed clothes and gear haphazardly into my pack, my hands shaking more than I wanted to admit. We loaded the truck with speed, casting glances at the treeline, half expecting to see someone step out, watching. As we pulled out of the clearing, the cabin shrank behind us, swallowed by trees. The forest looked calm, ordinary, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on us. The sense that whoever had walked into that cabin and touched our lives so intimately was still out there, standing somewhere in the timber watching us leave. We never went back to that cabin. Later, I thought about it often, about how nothing was stolen, nothing broken, about how carefully everything had been arranged. Whoever did it didn't want our things, they wanted us to know. They wanted to send a message, though I don't think it was about theft or harm. It felt more like control, a reminder that out there in the quiet, deep in those Idaho woods, we weren't the ones in charge. That's what unsettles me most even now. Not the piles themselves, but the patience it took to make them. The steady hands arranging boots and rifles and food, knowing we'd come back, knowing we'd see. It wasn't noise or violence. It was silent, careful intrusion. A stranger inside our space, leaving no face, no voice, no trace but the cold order of neat piles on a cabin floor. And that silence stays with me, out there in the timber, far from town, where the trees swallow every sound and no one else is near. Silence isn't comfort. It's a reminder of how easily someone can step into your world, move things around, and leave you to wonder just how close they really were. I had rented the cabin because I wanted space and quiet. It was early winter in Canada, deep enough into the season that snow lay thick across the ground, untouched except for the road in and the tracks from my truck. The cabin was small, one bedroom and a living area with a wood stove, set a fair distance from the nearest town. The trees stood dark and heavy all around, their branches sagging with snow. When I first arrived, the silence was what struck me most. The air felt still, sharp with cold, and the only sound was the crunch of my boots breaking through the frozen crust. The first couple of days were uneventful. I spent most of the time reading, writing, and taking short walks along the trails nearby. The snow muffled every sound, and the forest felt endless and hushed, the way it always does after a storm. At night, I would light the stove, eat a simple meal, and sit by the window watching the shadows lengthen across the snow. The place was peaceful, exactly what I thought I needed. The third night was when things changed. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. At first, I didn't know why. I thought maybe it was the wind or the crack of wood shifting in the stove. I lay there listening to the silence. The bedroom was dim, only the faintest glow of moonlight coming through the window. I closed my eyes again, ready to drift back into sleep, when I heard it. A soft, steady tapping. It wasn't loud. It was delicate, almost hesitant, like the tip of a fingernail tapping against glass. At first, I thought maybe it was a branch brushing against the window, stirred by a breeze. But then it came again, evenly spaced, deliberate.
Top, top, top.
I froze, eyes open now, staring at the window. The sound was close, too close. I turned my head slowly, and that's when I saw him. A face, inches away on the other side of the glass. Pale skin, dark eyes fixed on me. The features blurred slightly by the frost on the window, but close enough that there was no mistaking it. For one long second, I couldn't move. My heart hammered so hard I felt it in my throat. The face didn't shift, didn't blink, just stared. Adrenaline took over. I threw back the covers, scrambled to the door, and yanked it open. The cold hit me like a wall, my breath bursting out in white clouds. I ran around the side of the cabin in bare feet, the snow biting into my skin like knives. But there was nothing. No man, no movement. The snow lay smooth and undisturbed, except for the tracks I had just made. I stopped, chest heaving, breath loud in the still air. I scanned the treeline, the cabin walls, the roof. Nothing. Just quiet, white snow stretching in every direction. My feet burned with cold, and I hurried back inside, slamming the door shut behind me. The window looked the same as it had before. Frost edging the corners, glass fogged slightly from the heat inside. No smudge, no handprint, no sign that anyone had been pressed up against it. I barely slept the rest of the night. I sat in the chair by the stove, wrapped in a blanket, listening to the silence and staring at the window. Every flicker of shadow outside made my chest tighten. Every creak of wood made my ears strain. I told myself I must have imagined it. Maybe I had been half dreaming, caught between sleep and wakefulness, my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew what I saw. That face had been there. The next morning, I checked the ground again. I walked slowly around the cabin, scanning every inch of snow. My tracks from the night before were there, erratic and shallow where I had run barefoot, but nothing else. No prints leading to the window, no signs of anyone standing there. The snow was smooth, untouched. That unsettled me more than anything. If someone had been close enough to tap on the glass, close enough for me to see his face, there should have been prints. The snow was deep and soft. Even the lightest step left a clear impression. But there was nothing. The day dragged on with that thought chewing at me. I tried to distract myself with books, with making food, with chopping wood. But every time I glanced at the window, I felt the same tightness in my chest. I didn't want to stay another night, but the drive back was long, and the weather report had warned of icy roads. I told myself I could make it through one more. That evening, I locked the door twice, pulled the curtains closed, and stoked the stove until the cabin was hot. I sat awake for hours listening. The night was silent, no wind, no branches brushing against the walls, just stillness pressing in on every side. At some point, exhaustion won. I drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. I woke again to the sound of tapping, softer this time, like it was coming from farther away, but steady enough to snap me fully awake. My throat went dry, and I stared at the curtain, afraid to move it aside. The tapping stopped, then started again.
Top, top, top.
I forced myself to get up, my legs weak, and pulled the curtain open in one sharp motion. Nothing, just snow reflecting faint moonlight, smooth and untouched. I stayed there, my hand gripping the fabric, waiting for something to move, but nothing did. The rest of the night stretched on endlessly. Every minute felt like an hour. I sat in the chair again, blanket wrapped tight, the lantern burning low beside me. My eyes kept darting to the window, expecting to see a face pressed against it. But the glass stayed empty. When morning finally came, I didn't hesitate. I packed everything quickly, tossing clothes into my bag without folding them, checking and rechecking the locks on the truck. The forest around me was still, the snow bright under the early sun, but the peace I had felt when I first arrived was gone. The cabin felt different now, too open, too vulnerable, too quiet. As I drove away, the tires crunching over the frozen road, I couldn't stop glancing at the rearview mirror. The cabin shrank behind me, the tree leaves swallowing it whole, and I couldn't shake the image of that face at the window. Even now, I think about it. What unsettles me most isn't the tapping or the eyes staring back at me. It's the snow, the fact that there were no prints. Someone was there close enough to touch the glass, close enough that I saw every detail of his face. But the ground around the cabin told a different story. No steps, no tracks, no proof. And that leaves only two possibilities. Either my mind betrayed me, or someone out there knew exactly how to get that close without leaving a trace. Neither of those options lets me sleep easy. I had gone to the Catskills that week to get away from everything. My job had been grinding me down, and the constant noise of the city never seemed to stop echoing in my head. I rented a small cabin tucked up a dirt road, far enough into the trees that it felt like the world outside had vanished. It was exactly what I wanted. No neighbors, no cars, no sound but wind in the branches and the occasional call of a bird. The cabin itself was simple, just a single room with a stove, a cot, and a porch that looked out into endless trees. It was early November, the air damp and cold, and the leaves on the ground were already turning dark with rot. I was alone and I liked it that way. The days passed quietly. I'd wake up slow, make coffee on the small stove, and sit outside with my mug watching the fog drift through the trees. Sometimes I would take long walks along the trails that twisted off into the woods, but I never strayed too far. The Catskills have a way of swallowing you whole if you don't keep your bearings. At night, I'd light the lantern, make a simple dinner, and read or write until the cold made me crawl under the heavy blankets. I barely used my phone. I didn't want to. It was peaceful, and it felt like I was finally breathing again. By the fourth night, I was starting to feel fully at ease. I'd gone so long without hearing another human voice that I began to feel like the only person alive in those woods. The silence had weight to it. Even the little creaks of the cabin seemed to blend into the rhythm of nature around me. That night, I slept deeper than I had in months. It was the morning after that things changed. I woke up just as the first pale light was seeping into the room through the thin curtains. I stretched, pulled on my boots, and opened the cabin door to get a breath of the cold morning air. That's when I saw it. Right there, not 3 feet from my door, was a fire pit, a small circle of stones I hadn't made, and inside it, blackened wood and ash. Thin threads of smoke still rose from the smoldering pieces of char. It wasn't old. Whoever had built it had been there recently, very recently. I froze. My eyes swept the clearing around the cabin. Nothing seemed disturbed. The leaves were damp, clumped together from the dew, but I couldn't see any clear footprints. My own firewood stack was untouched. The door latch hadn't been broken, and nothing seemed missing from the porch. But the fire was undeniable. Someone had stood here in the night and built it while I was sleeping inside, unaware. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring at it. My skin prickled with unease. I hadn't seen another person since I arrived. No hikers, no hunters, no locals driving up the dirt road. Nothing. And now, suddenly, a fire pit appeared like someone had camped right outside my door. I got a stick and stirred the ashes. The wood was still hot, and when I shifted a blackened log, an ember glowed red. Whoever had been there couldn't have left more than a couple of hours ago, probably less. I felt exposed standing there in the open, so I kicked dirt over the pit until the smoke died, then went back inside and locked the door behind me. For the next hour, I sat by the window with my eyes on the trees, trying to calm myself. Maybe it had been hunters. Maybe someone had gotten lost and stopped there for the night without realizing the cabin was occupied. But I kept thinking about the strangeness of it. If someone was passing through, why build a fire right against the cabin door? There was plenty of space elsewhere. Why there, inches away from where I slept? That day dragged. I couldn't focus on reading or writing. I walked the perimeter of the clearing a few times, looking for signs, but I couldn't find any tracks clear enough to follow. The ground was soft, covered in wet leaves, and any imprints were quickly swallowed up. The woods that had felt so welcoming before now seemed to lean in around me, hiding things just out of sight. Every crack of a branch in the distance made me whip my head around. By nightfall, I was debating whether to pack up and leave early. But the road out was rough, and I wasn't sure I wanted to risk driving it in the dark. So I stayed. I locked the door, checked it twice, and sat by the lantern until I couldn't keep my eyes open. Sleep didn't come easy that night. I kept waking up, listening, straining to hear something over the rustle of the trees. When I finally dozed off, it wasn't deep. At some point in the early morning, I woke with the sense that something wasn't right. The air inside the cabin felt different, too still. I reached for my boots but stopped when I heard it, the faintest crunch of leaves outside the window. Not close but not far either. Slow, deliberate steps, then silence. I stayed frozen for a long time. I didn't move, didn't breathe too loud, just lay there listening. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under again, though my dreams were restless and broken. When dawn came, I forced myself to look outside. The fire pit was still there, cold now, just a ring of damp black ash. I didn't see anyone, and I didn't hear anything unusual. But I couldn't shake the thought that whoever had been there might still be nearby, watching, waiting for me to let my guard down. I packed my things quickly that morning. The peace-eyed comfort was gone, replaced by a sharp awareness that I wasn't alone out there. Maybe I never had been. I loaded my bag into the truck and gave the clearing one last look before I left. That little ring of stones stayed burned into my mind the whole drive down the mountain. It hadn't been there before, I knew that for certain, and it hadn't built itself. Someone had stood outside my cabin door, in the dead of night, so close I could have reached them through the wall. They'd made a fire not for warmth, not for cooking, but right there, in a place I would find it first thing in the morning. It felt deliberate, like a message. I never went back to that cabin again. When we rented the cabin in Utah, I wasn't expecting much more than creaky wood, drafty windows, and the kind of dust that lingers in old places nobody bothers to live in full-time anymore. It sat in a clearing at the base of low red cliffs, the kind of place where the sun seemed to hit hard during the day but the cold settled deep the moment it disappeared. The structure was old but intact, with gray logs darkened from years of weather, a heavy wooden door, and a sagging porch that leaned ever so slightly away from the house. There were 4 of us, me, my girlfriend, and another couple we were friends with. We wanted something quiet, something far away from the noise of cities, jobs, and routines. This cabin seemed perfect. No cell service, no neighbors, just a roof over our heads and the woods at our backs. The inside was what you'd expect from a place probably built more than 70 years ago. The floor was uneven. The walls had dark knots in the wood, and every step echoed more than it should have. There was a fireplace with a stone chimney, a table with mismatched chairs, and 2 small bedrooms. It wasn't much, but we thought it would do. The first day was easy. We unpacked, stacked some firewood, explored the trails near the clearing, and cooked dinner on a small stove we'd brought. When night came, it dropped quick. The wind through the pines rattled the cabin walls, and the only light came from the flicker of our lantern and the glow from the fireplace. It wasn't scary, not then. It was exactly what we signed up for. The windows were old, single-pane glass, framed in wood swollen from years of cold and heat. They rattled when the wind hit hard. A few of them had fingerprints or smudges that looked like they'd been there forever. Nothing unusual for a place like that. I remember checking them when we closed everything up for the night, mostly to make sure the cold stayed out. Nothing strange about them, just the usual grime of an old cabin. The morning it happened started off normal. It was cold, colder than the day before, the kind of cold that made you see your breath indoors before the fire really caught. I got up first and went to stoke the ashes back into flames. That's when I noticed the window to the left of the fireplace. At first I thought it was just fog on the glass, but when I leaned closer, my stomach turned. The entire inside of the window was covered in handprints. Small handprints, dozens of them. Palms, fingers, smears where they had dragged down the glass. It looked like children had pressed their hands against it from the inside and left them in every direction. I stepped back fast, and my first thought was that we'd somehow missed them the night before. But I knew we hadn't. I had stared at that same window before bed while tossing scraps of wood into the fire. It had been dirty, but not like this. When the others woke up, we checked the rest of the cabin. Every single window, 6 of them, had the same thing. Small handprints covering the inside of the glass, some overlapping, some smeared as if the hands had slid down. On the window near the door, there were so many that the light coming through was broken into dull shadows. The strangest part was how clean they looked against the otherwise dirty glass, as if fresh moisture or oil had been pressed into them. None of us spoke for a while. We just walked from room to room, staring. The day before, they hadn't been there. We were certain of that. And none of us had kids. There was no way this was some forgotten leftover from long ago. It was too sharp, too recent. I checked the cabin door. It was still locked, latch still in place. The windows were closed tight, just as we'd left them. Nothing had been forced. No sign anyone had come inside during the night. But there they were, those handprints, dozens and dozens of them, like children had been playing against the glass while we slept only feet away. The more I looked, the worse it felt. They weren't just random prints. On one of the bedroom windows, the prints seemed arranged in a rough circle, as if kids had crowded together, peering out into the night. On another, the prints smeared upward like someone had stood on tiptoe, reaching as high as they could. Each one small, too small. We tried to brush them off with rags, but it only smeared the moisture and made it worse. We opened one of the windows to see if maybe the prints could be explained by condensation forming overnight, but it didn't make sense. Condensation doesn't create perfectly shaped palms and tiny fingers pressed over and over in clear patterns. The unease settled in deep. That day we stuck close together, taking turns checking outside the cabin. There were no tracks in the dirt or pine needles around the perimeter. No sign anyone had come near. It was too cold for barefoot children to wander, too isolated for anyone to sneak around without us hearing. But the windows were impossible to ignore. Every time I looked up, I caught myself picturing small faces just beyond the glass in the dark. Night came hard. None of us wanted to admit it, but we were scared. We latched the door, stoked the fire, and sat around the table longer than usual, pretending to be interested in cards and half-hearted stories. But our eyes kept drifting back to the windows. We couldn't shake the feeling that the glass was holding something we weren't supposed to understand. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the old cabin made me flinch. I kept seeing those small hands in my mind, pressed against the glass. Only this time I imagined the sound of them tapping. Quiet, rhythmic, insistent. At some point, exhaustion pulled me under, but I didn't rest. My dreams were full of shadows moving outside the cabin walls. When morning came again, the prints were still there. Some looked fresher than before, clearer, like new ones had been added while we slept. That was enough. None of us argued about it. We packed our things fast, barely speaking, and loaded the truck. I took one last look at the cabin before we left. The windows were lit by the morning sun, each pane covered in the smeared shapes of children's hands. It looked like they were waving as we drove away. We never figured out how they got there. Maybe someone had been inside without us knowing. Maybe the old glass had held those marks for years, hidden until the right kind of cold made them bloom out. Maybe it was something simpler we just couldn't see in the moment. But the thing that stuck with me was how they weren't on the outside, where you'd expect prints from someone trying to look in. They were on the inside, every single one pressed from where we had been, as if they had been with us the whole time. I don't care about explanations anymore. I only know that I'll never rent a cabin like that again. We had rented a cabin deep in the Tennessee mountains for a long weekend, a chance to step away from work, school, and all the noise of everyday life. It was a small family trip, me, my spouse, and our 2 kids. The cabin sat at the end of a long gravel road, tucked between tall trees with the closest neighbor a good mile or 2 away. It looked like the kind of place you see on postcards. Wooden porch with rocking chairs, the faint smell of pine in the air, and quiet that felt thick compared to the constant background hum of town life. When we arrived, we brought in our bags and groceries, filled the fridge, and set up the bedrooms. The cabin was simple: 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, and a living area with a couch, a stone fireplace, and a small kitchen. The kids ran through the rooms, excited about sleeping somewhere new, while I carried wood inside for the fireplace. It felt good to be out there, away from traffic and screens, even though we still carried our phones and watches like lifelines. Out in the woods, you never know when you might need them. The first night passed quietly. We cooked, played a board game at the table, then turned in early. The cabin creaked in the wind and the roof popped in the cold, but nothing unusual happened. I slept hard. It was the second morning when I noticed something odd. I walked into the kitchen half awake, rubbing my eyes, and stopped. On the counter by the sink, lined up neatly in a row, were all of our phones and watches. For phones, 2 smartwatches, 2 kids' digital watches. They weren't tossed there, not dumped or stacked. They were arranged carefully, each one straight, spaced evenly, as if someone had taken the time to make them look orderly. For a second, I thought maybe my spouse had done it. Maybe the kids had dumped everything out before bed and they'd been picked up to keep the place tidy. But when I asked, everyone looked confused. The kids shrugged, still groggy, and said they'd left their watches on the nightstands. My spouse said the same, that they'd plugged their phone in beside the bed, not in the kitchen. I knew I had set mine on the nightstand too, because I always do that so I can check the time if I wake in the night. I walked over to the counter and looked at them closely. All of the devices were powered off. Not just asleep, not just locked, but fully shut down. The screens were dark, the buttons unresponsive. That chilled me more than seeing them moved. None of us ever shut them off. It takes a deliberate press and hold to power them down. Someone had taken the time to do that. The rest of the morning, I couldn't shake the unease. The kids brushed it off and ran outside to chase each other around the clearing. My spouse tried to focus on breakfast, but I noticed them glancing at the counter the way I was, as if both of us kept circling back to it in our heads. We checked the cabin. The doors were still locked, the windows closed. Nothing seemed out of place except for the phones and watches. There was no sign anyone had broken in, no muddy boot prints, no disturbed furniture. Just the devices lined up neatly as if presented. That night, the tension was harder to ignore. We double-checked the doors, made sure the locks were turned, and closed the curtains tight. I left my phone on the nightstand again, forcing myself to act like nothing was wrong, even though I kept picturing someone standing over us while we slept, carefully taking each item and carrying it into the kitchen. I didn't sleep much. Every creak of the cabin made my eyes snap open. When morning came, my stomach sank before I even checked. I walked into the kitchen, and there they were again. Phones and watches, lined up on the counter, powered off, perfectly spaced. It was the exact same arrangement as the day before. This time, I checked every door and window again, looking for any gap or weakness. I walked around the cabin outside, scanning the ground for footprints. The grass and dirt around the porch showed nothing but our own tracks. The gravel road didn't show much either, just the marks from our tires. Whoever was doing it wasn't leaving signs, or they knew how to cover them. The kids started to sense something was wrong. They asked why we looked worried, why we kept checking the locks. I told them it was just to be safe, but inside, my mind was racing. We were in the middle of nowhere. If someone had been coming into the cabin, they had every opportunity to do more than move our things. The fact that all they had done so far was line up the devices almost made it worse. It felt like a message, like a warning that they could do whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted. That third night was the longest of my life. I lay in bed wide awake, heart pounding, staring at the faint outline of the ceiling. I tried to listen for footsteps, for the sound of the door opening, but the cabin was drowned in silence except for the occasional groan of the wood beams. At some point, exhaustion dragged me into a light, uneasy sleep. When I opened my eyes again, it was gray outside, dawn light seeping through the curtains. I didn't want to go into the kitchen, but I had to. My chest tightened as I walked down the short hall. This time was different. The phones and watches were still on the counter, but they weren't just lined up. They were stacked, one on top of another, in a single tower. It looked like someone had taken the time to balance them carefully. The biggest phone at the bottom, the kids' watches near the top, almost like a sculpture. And again, every single one was powered off. That broke something in me. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't sleepwalking or forgetfulness. Someone was in that cabin with us at night, watching us sleep, taking the most personal items we owned, and arranging them with care. The neatness of it made it worse. It wasn't random theft or vandalism. It was deliberate, controlled. We didn't stay for the last night we'd booked. I told everyone to pack, and we shoved everything into bags without even eating breakfast. I kept looking out the windows, expecting to see someone standing just inside the tree line, but the woods stayed still. We loaded the car and drove back down the gravel road, not looking back at the cabin until it disappeared behind the trees. When we finally got home, I tried to explain it away in my mind. Maybe someone from the rental company had access, maybe it was some strange prank. But even that didn't fit. There was no reason for anyone to go into a cabin in the middle of the night just to shut off electronics and arrange them in patterns. What sticks with me the most isn't the sight of the devices lined up or stacked. It's the thought of the hours I lay there asleep, unaware, while someone walked quietly through the cabin. They had time to collect everything, time to shut them off one by one, time to place them just so, and then walk back out without leaving a trace. They were careful, patient, and they wanted us to know they had been there. That's why I'll never rent a cabin like that again. Out there, far from neighbors, with nothing but trees and silence, you think you're getting peace and quiet. But if someone decides to come into your space, you won't hear them. You won't know until you wake up in the morning and find proof on the counter that you weren't nearly as alone as you thought. I own a small cabin in the Colorado mountains. Nothing fancy, just a place I've had for years where I can get away from the noise of town. It's tucked down a dirt road, surrounded by tall pines and a ridge that blocks out most of the wind. The cabin is basic: 2 rooms, a wood stove, an old propane cooktop, and a porch that creaks when you walk across it. I built most of it myself, and I know every sound it makes. I know the way the walls settle, the way the windows rattle in the wind, and I know how it looks when I leave and when I come back. That's why what happened that afternoon shook me so badly. I'd driven into town early in the morning to get groceries and fuel. It was a normal trip, nothing out of the ordinary. The drive into town from the cabin takes about 45 minutes, winding down gravel roads and through thick stands of trees before you hit pavement. I wasn't in a rush. I picked up supplies, had breakfast at a diner, filled up the truck, and grabbed some firewood bundles from the hardware store. By the time I made it back up into the mountains, it was early afternoon. The sun was high, the air cool and sharp. As I came around the last bend in the road, I noticed it immediately. My cabin door was wide open. It wasn't swinging on the hinges like it had been blown by the wind. It was open all the way, fixed in place like someone had pushed it and left it that way. My stomach dropped. I pulled the truck up slowly, gravel crunching under the tires, and sat there for a moment with the engine running. I looked at the porch, at the open door, at the shadows inside. Nothing moved. The forest was quiet around me, too quiet for the middle of the day. Usually there'd be birds calling, maybe the sound of squirrels in the trees, but I didn't hear a thing. I killed the engine and sat there listening. The silence pressed in. I grabbed the small hatchet I keep behind the seat. Not much, but it felt better than walking in empty-handed, and climbed out. My boots sounded too loud on the gravel. I stepped up onto the porch, heart thudding, and leaned into the doorway. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Coffee. Fresh, strong coffee, the kind you can smell from across the room. My eyes darted toward the stove, and sure enough, there was my old metal percolator pot sitting on the burner, steam rising from the spout, the faint hiss of water bubbling inside. I froze there, staring. I hadn't made coffee. I hadn't even been home since sunrise. Someone had been in my cabin, not just inside but comfortable enough to dig out the coffee pot, fill it with water and grounds, and set it to brew. The smell of it filled the room, rich and sharp, like it was meant to be noticed. I stepped inside slowly, scanning everything. My groceries from the day before were still stacked neatly on the counter. The woodpile by the stove was undisturbed. The table and chairs sat where I'd left them. My pack and tools were untouched. Nothing looked stolen. Nothing looked rifled through. It was as if someone had come in, made themselves a pot of coffee, and left the rest alone. The worst part was the sense of order. Whoever it was hadn't been in a rush. They hadn't torn through drawers or knocked things over. They had taken their time, moved with care, and left the place as neat as I had. That unsettled me more than any theft would have. I walked through the cabin carefully. Bedroom, same as I'd left it. Bathroom, nothing out of place. Back door, still locked from the inside. No broken glass, no pry marks on the frames. Whoever had come in had used the front door, and they'd closed it behind them when they left, only for it to be wide open when I returned. I went back to the kitchen, staring at that pot of coffee. The burner clicked faintly under the heat, the lid rattling with the pressure. I reached out, touched the handle. It was hot. That meant it hadn't been there long. Whoever had made it had been there recently, maybe only minutes before I pulled up. That thought made my skin crawl. I turned off the burner and carried the pot outside, dumping the contents onto the dirt. The black liquid hissed as it hit the ground. My eyes kept darting to the tree line, to the dark spaces between trunks. I felt watched, though I didn't see a soul. I should have packed up and left right then. But part of me couldn't believe it. I told myself it had to be some mistake. Maybe a neighbor, though there weren't any close enough to make sense, had stopped by and helped themselves. Maybe it was someone passing through, a hunter or hiker who thought the place was abandoned. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't random. I stayed the night, but I barely slept. Every sound of the cabin made me tense. I left the hatchet on the floor beside the bed, my boots still on. The fire in the stove popped and hissed, shadows moving across the ceiling, and I lay there listening for footsteps that never came. By morning, I was exhausted. I made my own coffee, trying to shake off the night, but it didn't taste the same. I kept picturing that pot left on the stove, how neat it had been, how deliberate. Before heading back into town, I did a slow walk around the property. That's when I found them. Footprints. Not mine. They were faint but clear enough in the soft dirt at the side of the cabin. The tread was different from my boots, smaller, lighter, more like sneakers. They led from the porch steps toward the trees, then disappeared into the undergrowth. Seeing those prints locked it in for me. Someone had been there. They had walked right up, gone inside, brewed coffee, and walked back out like it was their place. The open door felt like an invitation or maybe a warning, like they wanted me to know they had been comfortable enough to do it. I locked up, loaded the truck, and drove away, checking my rearview mirror the whole way down the gravel road. I still own that cabin, but I don't stay there the way I used to. I go during the day, never overnight. I keep the locks checked and the windows nailed shut, but deep down I know if someone wanted to come in, they could. They already proved it. And what stays with me most isn't the open door or even the footprints. It's the coffee. That pot on the stove wasn't just an accident. It wasn't random. Whoever was in there had wanted me to find it, wanted me to walk in and see the steam rising, to smell it and know. They could have taken anything. They could have done anything. But instead, they left me a message I'll never forget. You're not alone out here, not even in your own place. That's the last time the cabin felt like it belonged to me. From that day forward, I've known someone else considers it theirs too.